I okay. And I did have an image of the book up when I opened the chat and closed it, and the slide moved on. I don't know quite why, but anyway, there we are. We can come back to that. Thank you very much indeed. And I think I should start by saying I feel a little bit of an interloper, that I'm not I'm not Cornish myself, although I've got links with Cornwall, some vague family links, and I do love West Cornwall especially. John Wesley's, I've called this title Roads, Rocks and Rain, this talk, John Wesley's journal as travel writing about Cornwall. John Wesley first, and I'll introduce, in case you don't, well, I'll do an introduction to John Wesley in a little while. John Wesley first went to Cornwall in 1743. His last visit was 46 years later. And during that time, he wrote quite a bit about Cornwall, including observations about, well, roads, rocks and rain, the environment and the climate. Very usefully for my, where have we got? Come on, that's right, the slide's not moving on, there we are. What I think are the two most reasonable portraits of John Wesley, you have to be careful what I say about that, are very neatly bookend those years. The portrait by Williams with him as a fairly young academic, and the one by George Romney of 46 years later. Right, quick introduction to John Wesley for those who might not know. His life spanned most of the 18th century. He was, first of all, an Oxford Don. He was an academic. And while at Oxford, his brother Charles formed a small group of people who were interested in religion, which got the nickname Methodists. And John Wesley, who I think was I find him somewhat an obsessive character, should we say, he automatically ended up as the leader of this. He became ordained as a Church of England clergyman, and after various events, in 1738, he underwent an evangelical experience. The following year, he started a career of 50 years of public preaching, and more importantly, in a way, he organized people into religious societies, small Methodist religious societies around the country, and traveled around the country every year, not principally to preach, but principally to visit the societies. He was also, and he developed a regular itinerary around the country, which was publicized, and notices went out in advance of where he'd be and when. He was also one of the, I think possibly the most voluminous publisher and writer and editor of the century, around 400 titles. And one of the things he did was to bring his publishing operation in-house. So he not only wrote things, but the organization was also publishing and selling them. By the time he died, 1791, there were approximately 70,000 members of the societies in Britain, and about the same number in America. Now, very difficult to number, because Methodism has this membership, but also a sort of wider figure of people who are attached to, or as regarded as part of the Methodist communion, and numbering, it's reckoned something like 70, 80, 90 million, depending how you count them. And of course, it spawned other religious movements, such as the Salvation Army. And not forgetting his brother Charles, who was a poet, who wrote something around 70. It's difficult to compute exactly how many poems he wrote, religious verses, And I upset Methodists, any Methodists who are listening, because I say that many of them got ruined by being set to music. There's some wonderful poetry. It doesn't always translate well into music. Moving on now after that little comment. John Wesley published a journal every few years. And I think I want to say how that came about. First of all, from the 1720s, when he was a young man at Oxford, he kept a regular diary with entries every so often through the day, quite systematically, and that was done latterly anyway in a shorthand. You can see an example on the right hand side. A scheme devised by John Byrom. Actually our John Wesley lecture here in Oxford, which will also be online in 2 months' time, 24th of May, will be on the John Byrom shorthand. Then he published his journal from 1738. What happened is he went to America. Some of you will know this, and things didn't go well for him. He fell for a young lady, but could never bring himself to take it any further. And she ended up marrying somebody else. He was furious and made a bit of a fool of himself, and found himself the subject of court action. He did a moonlight flit and came back to Britain, although they tried to enact the court action in London. But he wanted to put his account of things into the public domain, so he published his journal initially. So the original purpose was to exonerate his own actions, but he soon became aware that this was actually a very useful vehicle for propagating the Methodist movement that he was becoming part of. But it's not just an account of him and his religion. It's got all sorts of other observations, and that's why it's a particularly interesting document if you're studying the 18th century. So what's really important to know is the process by which this publication came into being from the daily diaries. Towards the end of each year, I think, John Wesley, when he couldn't travel the country, the roads weren't good enough, he was in London, he would go through his diary for the year and write it up as a summary. Seems to be, we're not quite clear what the process is, but this seems to be a sort of what the process was. And then every 4 or 5 years, he would bring all those together and compile it for publication. And at that point, he might want to edit it. I mean, it all got edited twice before publication, and boiled down quite a lot from the ordinary everyday events into things that would interest people, and obviously tailored things to the public interest at that point. It was read by many people. The original print runs were around 500, rising towards the end of his life to 2,000, went to several editions. And in the 20th century and still into the 21st, the big Works of John Wesley project of critical academic editions is still in progress. And so the journals and diaries have been published in the last, towards the end of the 20th century, gets the right century in the end, towards the end of the 20th century in modern critical editions. But just to summarize that, so before we sort of really get going more, the nature of John Wesley's journal, it's not the objective record it's often treated as, Professor Liz J says similarly that Wesley was sort of exercising his descriptive talents and on the people he met, and to some extent on the places. So Charles Wesley was the first of the two brothers to visit in 1743, followed by his brother a couple of months later. John Wesley then made 33 visits to Cornwall in the 46 years following. These were recorded in his journal, so that, as I'm sure you know, Cornwall became the strongest Methodist area in Britain. In the 1851 religious census, it was the only county in the country where the predominant religion was Methodist. One of the things we have is the Wesleyan Methodist Atlas in the collections at the centre. Is the Wesleyan Methodist Atlas of the 1870s, and it has coloured dots for all the different chapels, and the around west of Truro Redruth area. It's absolutely full of coloured dots for the different chapels. It's very, very visually convincing. So. One of the things about John Wesley's career is that I say he surfaced an incoming tide. It was the age of reason. He was a man of reason. I think the warm waters of traditional religion met the cold waters of the Enlightenment, and in some ways Methodism was the fusion of those two strands. It was an age when literacy was growing, printing and paper production were all changing. Books were becoming much more popular, much more affordable. Communications, when John Wesley first went to Cornwall, the roads were virtually impassable. That all changed in his lifetime. Things like the postal system. At the beginning of the century, it was a state monopoly. If you wanted a letter to go, say from Penzance to Newcastle, it would go via London. It would be double charged and was expensive. And it was actually one of the Ralph Allen, who was one of the entrepreneurs in Bath, who made Bath what it was, who invented the cross post. So you could actually, it was a private enterprise thing. You could actually send letters direct, and this revolutionized the postal system, and so on. The beginnings of industry. I wonder to what extent Cornwall changed considerably in that time, and I wonder whether Wesley's journal actually helped people to perceive of Cornwall not as being that remote country in the far west, but actually somewhere much more amenable. Charles Wesley. This is Charles Wesley's first visit. He had a hard time getting down to Cornwall. Both horse and rider were worked down. It took me 4 hours from Bodmin to Mitchell. John Wesley was even similarly. He got lost on Bodmin Moor, and then heard Bodmin bell 8 o'clock in the evening in August. It's getting to dusk. Well, he says about sunset, and then he managed to get into Bodmin. So contrast those with his last visit, where he was going from Truro to Falmouth, and he couldn't go by the road because they were building the turnpike. The road works even then, and so he was able to take a cut over some fields and managed to get down to Falmouth. But by then, and as I think we'll see on this map, of 1784, the road system in Cornwall was developing. One of the myths is that John Wesley went everywhere on horseback. He did initially. He went, but he also went. He used a stagecoach. In his very early days, he walked. After around 1760, his preachers insisted he have a little carriage, a chaise, which is basically it's a chair on wheels with a sort of weather covering, and he went and he had that fitted up with a bookshelf and so on, so he could actually do reading, and he from then on, for the last 30 years or so of his life, he generally used the chaise. So this is him in Cornwall. He nearly, I think the horse nearly fell into an old tin mine, and but another time I forget where he'd been. So he wanted to ride across to take the shortcut across the sands to St Agnes, but that wasn't going to work. So he had to. It's just you know, well, sands being bad for the chaise. In 1777, and this is doesn't say much about Cornwall really, but just to give you an idea of travel wasn't all that bad. He'd been preaching that morning. It was a Sunday, preaching that morning in St Agnes, and then at Gwinnett in the evening. He'd been getting letters saying that the situation in Dublin with the Methodist societies there was absolutely dire, and he decided, I need to be in Dublin. So he took the chaise and got to Pembrokeshire I'm not going to try to pronounce that, in 2 days. That is not bad going. What of course then happened is that that he couldn't get a boat. The sea was becalmed, and it took him the rest of the week to get across to Dublin. So that's a little bit about road travel. He also made observations about the world about him. Remember, John Wesley was brought up in Lincolnshire. It's all very flat. And whenever he encountered what we would not think of as great hills, he used phrases like those horrid mountains. So here he rode over the mountains close by the sea at Toulouse, and in Polperro it's surrounded with huge mountains. Well, are they? But that's how he perceived them. In those days, before the Romantic movement of the late 18th century, when hills and mountains became something picturesque and something people admired, hills and mountains were seen as an obstacle and a hostile environment. Part of what changed that, I think, was Samuel Johnson's journey to the Hebrides of the 1770s. Similarly, when he visited Land's End several times, and there you are, he was awestruck by Land's End. And he said, I think I repeat this somewhere, 17 he thought the sea had gained some 100 yards since I was here 40 years ago. I'm not sure where he was at that point, because it seems to be a pretty fixed point. Again, Land's End, an awful sight. He went to the Scillies on his first visit, and he was not impressed. A barren, dreary place. I don't think many people would say that now. Visited St Michael's Mount. And here he walked near the sea at Poole's Hole, and from about the 1750s to the 1780s, he didn't make many comments about the environment. It's only towards the beginning of his Cornish journeys and towards the end. But in the 1750s, he witnessed what he called an earthquake. Quite what that was is debatable. Gwithian is the old village had been buried under the sand and so on. So you get these comments. Sorry, I'm having problems with moving the slide on. One feature you will know, I'm sure, is Gwynap Pit. John Wesley preached at Gwynap for 20 years, and just in village, and then in 1762, he says that I couldn't stand in the usual place, and so we found this little hollow, and then he continued to use the pit. That then became his regular preaching place, and regular to the extent, usually on a Sunday evenings, 5 p.m. it is John Wesley at Gwynap Pit. And from my knowledge, especially at that time of year, August, September, when most of his visits took place, I think the onshore and offshore winds, it's quiet at that time of day, and I think he used that. He was aware of what the weather was doing, and was able to do that. And his voice, I think his voice carried. It was and he reckoned there were 20,000 people there. We tend to think that's an exaggerated figure. We had George Whitefield was the other great Methodist leader, was supposed to be able to preach to many thousands of people, and we had an interesting paper presented to a conference a few years ago by someone who is a sort of sound. He'd done scientific research on how sound carried. And was able to explore this, and actually reckoned that these figures of thousands of people are actually not as exaggerated as we tend to think. Then they knew how to get their voice to carry. The hearers knew they had to be quiet, and these estimates are not that far out. The pit you've seen, some of you will know, but is nothing. This is one of the popular images of Wesley preaching to 25,000 persons. It's a painting. That painting was exhibited in Truro in the 1840s, and what happened to it, I have no idea. Whether it's still lurking somewhere in Cornwall, who knows? Unlikely now. But it's actually based on what was a popular print, an apocalyptic composition by the artist who was good at these sort of things, John Martin, and that's what that picture is all about. It echoes John Martin's painting. So this is all stuff from my book. However, of course, there was one feature Wesley did more consistently note: the climatic conditions, Cornish rain. Come on. So that actually gets his most comments. So the 18th century was a time of some climatic extremes, and in the middle of the century, you have what's called a little ice age. And then in 1783, what happened was that there was a huge volcanic eruption in Iceland, coated much of Western Europe in a sort of brown dust. And for the rest of that decade, there were hot, dry summers, and the harvests failed repeatedly. So when in 1789, the French peasants were revolting, and the famous incident of Marie Antoinette being told that they have no bread, and she says, puisses-tu mange du brioche? Why don't they eat brioche? It's actually, they had no bread because the harvest had failed yet again. And if you've been to France, you know how the French diet is still, there's a great deal of bread in the French diet. So that was the 1780s. Sorry, I'm having issues here with my PowerPoint. I don't know where that went. So John Wesley kept, this is one of his journal entries for his, yes, this is his second visit to Cornwall in 1744. My clock's just striking past, so I realise I ought to be moving on. And now this is the beginning of April. He finds Bodmin Moor deep in snow. They came to Trewint. Some of you will know there's still the cottage at Trewint, which is their sort of was their stopping up over point coming into and out of Cornwall. And someone about halfway down, he said, Diggory. Well, we now call him Diggory Isbell. And I don't know whether this is the first time they encountered him, but he became their regular host and so on. And then it starts hailing and so on. So there's a interesting comment about the weather in Cornwall in April. What's he doing? So yes, and Charles Wesley on his first visit saw a strange light, the sun shining in Cornwall. But John Wesley's regular pattern became 2 weeks in Cornwall towards the end of August, beginning of September. That was his regular thing. And I cannot resist this, my interpretation of the statue of Charles Wesley in Bristol. No, he comes out and he puts his hand out and it's raining again. It's not always raining in Cornwall, of course, for Mr. Wesley. Sometimes quite the opposite. It was extremely hot, but he does make these comments about preaching in Camelford and the rain pouring down all the time. But that didn't hinder the congregation. And then such a shower of rains I never saw before. Because he'd spent time in America and experienced some heavy, heavy American storms. It's not that he travelled widely in Europe, although he did travel to Holland a few times. In Redruth, the rain ceased just in time, and then after preaching, the storm arose, and so on. So you get these comments about the rain. There we are. In 1780, and I have to say, I, with all due respect, much as I love Cornwall, I have had once or two holidays when it's been like this. There's been an absolute heat wave up here, and you get down to Cornwall and it's very different. And a mild rain began, followed us almost to the Land's End. 2 weeks later, he's heading out of Cornwall, up towards Bristol, and finds, no, the heat wave's still going up there. And then the following year, another storm of rain, which just soaked through the weatherproof curtains on the chaise. And the following year, then he prayed to stop the bottles of heaven. It's a quote from Job. You can look that up. There was more. He observed this burning wind which destroyed the potatoes and cabbages. 1760, he saw a water spout near Mousehole, then a little while time, a couple of weeks later, he wanted to cross the Tamar at Saltash, and just nobody would take him, so he had to ride up to Gunners Lake to cross over the bridge, the new bridge, and so on. So there are some observations. Something did happen is that he ran into Dr. Forsaith, It was in 1745, Bonnie Prince Charlie's invasion fleet sailed very close in to Land's End, and I think there were fears that the Young Pretender would land with his army and start his invasion in the West Country, and so one of John Wesley's preachers was pressed, and in fact John Wesley himself was nearly pressed, and so John Wesley went to the local court where Forays was sitting to try to get Mr. Maxfield released. So that was then. He also made comments on the smuggling. Things came over the cliffs, which he found absolutely reprehensible. But I think by the end of the century, but by the end of his life, I think many of the Methodists were seeing that smuggling was perhaps not for them. He got ill in 1753, lived half a day on claret and water. Fair enough. And he read Forays, makes comments about Penryn, Truro, and so on. Well, yes, I mean, that's sort of whether that was a local cure or what, I don't know. In the 7 Years' War, there were French prisoners at Verdruth, and he noted how they treated the English soldiers. At Polperro, yes, this is a nice one. The fishy smell was really just too much for him. And then right at Cornwall was changing dramatically by the late 18th century, especially the West, with all the mineral production, and they built a new preaching house, new chapel in Hale of the slags, of the waste material, which is unfortunately is no longer there. I don't think there are even any pictures of it. Right, let's go. Gave an account of a rock fall at Delabole Quarry. At Camborne, a man in the great dearths relieved great numbers of the poor. And I have to say, I understand that people at Camborne Centenary Church now have a fantastic food bank operation going. That's what I understand. I'd be interested if anybody knows of this. Camborne is, I like Camborne. It's not the easiest area. In Truro, on his last visit, the tinners were starving and were rioting in the streets. And he writes about that. And then, as I said, in his last visit, he went round by the roads. And in Falmouth, people high and low lined the streets from the town, from one end of the town to the other, and how things had changed in those 43 years. So thank you very much. I've talked for slightly longer than I intended to, but I hope that's given you an insight into reading John Wesley's journal in a rather different way. There's a lot in there. I just skipped over it, a lot of it, about Cornwall and about the Cornish people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. That was fascinating. As you say, so many different things in there.